The HOA's initial letter might have seemed like a minor inconvenience, but Alex quickly realized that the situation was about to escalate. On a crisp Saturday morning, just 3 days after receiving the envelope, Alex heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside his home. He glanced out the window to see 3 cars pulling into his driveway. Stepping onto the porch, he saw Mrs. Pemberton, the chairperson of the HOA, emerge from the lead vehicle, flanked by 2 other members of the association. They carried clipboards, blueprints, and an air of authority that bordered on intimidation. Mrs. Pemberton was a woman who commanded attention without saying a word. Her perfectly styled hair, sharp blazer, and polished loafers gave her an almost regal presence. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the pavement as though she owned the neighborhood. Behind her trailed Mr. Grayson, a retired engineer known for his obsession with rules, and Ms. Lynn, a soft-spoken accountant who rarely spoke, but always nodded in agreement with whatever Mrs. Pemberton said. Together, they formed what many residents jokingly referred to as the HOA Tribunal. Alex greeted them politely, though he couldn't shake the feeling that this visit wasn't going to be friendly. "Good morning," he said, stepping down from the porch. "What brings you here today?" Mrs. Pemberton wasted no time getting to the point. "Mr. Carter," she began, her tone clipped and formal, "we're here regarding the structure you've erected in your backyard." She gestured vaguely toward the oak tree where the treehouse stood, its faded American flag fluttering gently in the breeze. "As per our community guidelines, this addition violates several key regulations. We've reviewed the matter thoroughly, and we must insist that it be addressed immediately." Alex crossed his arms, his expression calm but curious. "I received your letter," he replied evenly, "but I don't believe the treehouse poses any real issue. It's safe, it's not obstructing anything, and my kids love it. Can we discuss this further?" Mrs. Pemberton raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his attempt to reason. "Mr. Carter, let me make this clear. The height of the structure exceeds the maximum allowance of 8 feet. Additionally, it lacks proper permits, and its design does not conform to the aesthetic standards outlined in our charter. These are non-negotiable rules designed to maintain the integrity of our community." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Alex took a moment to process them. He'd expected resistance, but the sheer rigidity of their stance surprised him. Still, he remained composed, drawing on years of experience navigating tense situations. "I understand your concerns," he said slowly, "but surely there's room for compromise. This is just a small play area for my children. It doesn't affect anyone else." Ms. Lynn shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Mrs. Pemberton, as if seeking permission to speak. When none came, she stayed silent. Mr. Grayson, however, chimed in, his voice gruff and dismissive. "Compromise isn't part of the equation here, Mr. Carter. Rules are rules. If everyone started bending them, this neighborhood would descend into chaos." Alex suppressed a sigh. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered people like Mr. Grayson, individuals so fixated on order that they lost sight of common sense. But arguing with them now wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he decided to take a different approach. "All right," he said, nodding thoughtfully. "Let me review the specific guidelines you mentioned. I'll look into making adjustments if necessary." Mrs. Pemberton seemed satisfied, at least for the moment. "See that you do," she said firmly. "You have 72 hours to resolve this matter. Failure to comply will result in escalating actions, including potential fines, and removal of the structure." With that, she turned on her heel, signaling the end of the conversation. The trio climbed back into their cars and drove off, leaving Alex standing alone in his driveway. As the sound of engines faded into the distance, Alex felt a mix of frustration and amusement bubbling inside him. Frustration because the whole ordeal felt absurd. Who cared about a harmless treehouse? And amusement because, despite their stern demeanor, the HOA members reminded him of bureaucrats he'd dealt with during his time at the White House. People who clung to rules not because they were meaningful, but because they provided a sense of control. Later that afternoon, Alex sat at his kitchen table staring at the stack of papers the HOA had left behind. Among them were copies of the neighborhood charter, detailed diagrams highlighting alleged violations, and a list of penalties for non-compliance. As he flipped through the documents, he noticed something peculiar. While the language was strict, some of the rules were vague or open to interpretation. For example, the height restriction clause didn't specify whether measurements should include decorative elements like the flagpole. Similarly, the section on aesthetics offered no concrete criteria beyond vague phrases like harmonious design. Alex leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table. Years of tactical planning had taught him to think several steps ahead, and this situation was no exception. Rather than reacting impulsively, he decided to treat the HOA dispute as he would any other mission. First, he needed information, facts that could either strengthen his position or expose weaknesses in the HOA's argument. Second, he needed allies. Even the most well-prepared strategy required support from others to succeed. Finally, he needed patience. Rushing into a confrontation would only play into the HOA's hands. Over the next few days, Alex put his plan into motion. He started by reaching out to a neighbor named Mark, a laid-back guy who lived 2 doors down and often shared beers with Alex on weekends. During one such gathering, Alex casually brought up the HOA's visit. "They're pretty serious about enforcing the rules," Mark admitted, sipping his drink. "But honestly, I think they pick and choose who to hassle. Remember Mrs. Harper's garden shed? That thing's been there for years, and it's way taller than your treehouse." Intrigued, Alex asked more questions, learning that inconsistencies in enforcement weren't uncommon. Some residents quietly ignored the HOA's demands, knowing they wouldn't face consequences unless someone complained. Others, however, caved under pressure, unwilling to deal with the hassle. Armed with this knowledge, Alex dug deeper, poring over online forums and local news articles about similar disputes. He discovered that many HOAs operated less like benevolent overseers and more like private fiefdoms, wielding power arbitrarily and often without legal justification. Meanwhile, Alex kept a close eye on Jake and Liam, who remained blissfully unaware of the brewing conflict. To them, the treehouse was still a magical fortress where imagination ruled supreme. One evening, as they played outside, Liam shouted up to his dad, "Hey, Dad! Can we add a secret trapdoor next?" Alex chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "We'll see," he replied, though privately he vowed to keep the treehouse intact no matter what. By the time the 72-hour deadline arrived, Alex had gathered enough evidence to challenge the HOA's claims. More importantly, he'd identified a handful of neighbors willing to support him, not just because they liked him personally, but because they too were tired of the HOA's overreach. What had started as a simple disagreement over a treehouse was rapidly transforming into something bigger, a test of wills between ordinary homeowners and the self-appointed gatekeepers of suburban perfection. And Alex? He was ready. In a quiet, picturesque neighborhood where every house looked like it had been plucked straight out of a home decor magazine, there lived a man named Alex Carter. To his neighbors, he was just another face in the crowd, a hard-working dad with 2 energetic boys who loved playing outside as much as any other kids their age. His older son, Jake, was 10 years old and full of curiosity about the world around him, while 8-year-old Liam preferred climbing trees and dreaming up wild adventures. Together they made life in the Carters' home lively, noisy, and fun. Alex had always tried to give his kids the kind of childhood he remembered fondly from his own youth, full of freedom, imagination, and plenty of time spent outdoors. So when Jake and Liam came running into the house one Saturday morning, breathless and excited, asking if they could have a treehouse, Alex didn't hesitate. "Of course," he said with a grin. "Let's build something amazing." The idea quickly became reality. Over the next few weekends, Alex worked tirelessly in his backyard under the shade of an enormous oak tree that stood tall at the edge of their property. With some leftover lumber, nails, and paint, he pieced together a modest but sturdy little fort. It wasn't fancy. It had a slanted roof, a rope ladder that swayed slightly in the breeze, and even a small flagpole flying a faded American flag. But to Jake and Liam, It was nothing short of magical. They spent hours each day clambering up the rope ladder, pretending to be pirates guarding their treasure or astronauts exploring distant planets. The sound of their laughter echoed through the neighborhood, brightening even the dullest afternoons. To most people passing by, Alex seemed like your typical suburban dad, friendly enough, maybe a bit reserved, but ultimately unremarkable. What no one realized, not even his closest neighbors, was that beneath this ordinary exterior lay years of extraordinary experience. Before settling down in this sleepy community, Alex had spent over a decade working behind the scenes for the U.S. government, specifically within the White House. His official title was Tactical Operations Coordinator, though few outside his circle truly understood what that meant. In simpler terms, Alex was the person everyone relied on during high-pressure situations, whether it involved coordinating emergency evacuations during natural disasters, planning security details for top officials traveling abroad, or managing logistics for classified missions. Alex thrived in environments where split-second decisions mattered more than anything else. His job required patience, precision, and an uncanny ability to stay calm under pressure. He'd learned how to read people, anticipate problems before they arose, and navigate complex systems without losing sight of the bigger picture. These skills weren't just useful in the corridors of power, they also came in handy in everyday life. But lately, Alex had chosen to step back from the constant chaos of Washington politics. Remote work allowed him to focus on raising his boys and enjoying the slower pace of suburban living. Or so he thought. One crisp Tuesday morning, as Alex sipped his coffee on the porch while watching Jake and Liam scramble up the rope ladder of their beloved treehouse, a white envelope arrived in the mail. It bore the logo of the Homeowners Association, HOA, the governing body responsible for maintaining order and uniformity in the neighborhood. Curious, Alex opened it and began reading. At first glance, the letter appeared polite and professional, thanking him for being a valued member of the community, but as he scanned further, the tone shifted. The HOA claimed that the treehouse violated several bylaws related to height restrictions, structural guidelines, and aesthetic conformity. Essentially, they wanted him to either modify the treehouse or tear it down entirely. Alex sighed, setting the letter aside. This wasn't the first time someone in the neighborhood had received a complaint from the HOA. A neighbor once got reprimanded for painting her front door red instead of sticking to the approved color palette. Another family faced fines because their mailbox leaned slightly to the left. Most of these issues were minor annoyances, easily resolved with a quick apology and a promise to fix things. Alex figured this would be no different. After all, the treehouse was harmless. It didn't block anyone's view, pose a safety hazard, or disrupt the peace. Surely the HOA would see reason once he explained himself. But deep down, Alex sensed trouble brewing. Years of dealing with difficult personalities in high-stakes situations had taught him to recognize certain patterns. The overly formal language in the letter, combined with vague references to potential violations and necessary actions, suggested that the HOA wasn't interested in negotiation. They wanted compliance, and they expected it immediately. Still, Alex decided not to jump to conclusions. He'd wait and see how things played out before taking any drastic measures. After all, this was just a treehouse. How bad could it really get? Little did Alex know this seemingly trivial dispute would soon spiral into something far more complicated and personal. For now, though, he pushed the matter to the back of his mind, determined to enjoy the rest of his morning. As he called Jake and Liam inside for breakfast, the boys chattered excitedly about their plans to decorate the treehouse with posters and string lights. Watching them, Alex couldn't help but smile. No matter what challenges lay ahead, one thing was certain: he'd do whatever it took to protect the joy and innocence of his children's childhood, even if it meant going toe-to-toe with the HOA. The day of reckoning had arrived. The neighborhood meeting was set to take place in the community center's stuffy multi-purpose room, a space that usually hosted bingo nights and holiday potlucks. But today, it carried an air of tension, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Alex Carter arrived early, dressed casually but with purpose. Jeans, a neatly pressed shirt, and a folder tucked under his arm. He wanted to project calm authority without appearing confrontational. After all, this wasn't about winning a fight. It was about fostering understanding. As neighbors began filing into the room, Alex greeted each person warmly, shaking hands and exchanging small talk. Some came out of curiosity, others out of solidarity, and a few because they genuinely cared about the outcome. The turnout surprised even Alex. Nearly 30 residents had shown up, far more than he'd anticipated. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, clutching her knitting bag like armor, Mr. Patel, standing quietly near the back with his teenage son, and Mark, who gave Alex a thumbs up from across the room. Even some of the HOA's usual supporters seemed hesitant, glancing around nervously, as if unsure which side to root for. Mrs. Pemberton and her team entered last, their arrival marked by the sharp click of heels against tile. She wore her signature blazer and an expression of forced confidence, flanked by Mr. Grayson and Ms. Lynn. They took seats at the front, arranging their clipboards and papers with deliberate precision. For a moment, the room fell silent. Everyone, waiting to see how the showdown would unfold. Alex stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone slightly before addressing the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady and warm. "I know we're all busy people, so I appreciate your time. This isn't about me or my treehouse. It's about fairness and transparency. Our neighborhood is a community, not just a collection of rules. Let's have an open discussion about how we can work together to make sure those rules serve everyone." His opening remarks set the tone. Respectful, collaborative, and focused on shared values rather than personal grievances. Then, using the whiteboard behind him, Alex launched into his presentation. He started by explaining the HOA's claims, breaking them down point by point. "They've cited 3 main issues," he said, writing each one on the board: height restrictions, lack of permits, and aesthetic non-compliance. But when we look closer, these concerns don't hold up. He flipped through his folder, pulling out copies of the HOA charter and zoning laws. Take the height restriction, for example. The rule says structures can't exceed 8 feet, but it doesn't specify whether decorative elements like the flagpole count. And according to local zoning laws, the city has final say on structural safety, not the HOA. He paused, letting the information sink in. Murmurs rippled through the audience as people leaned forward, intrigued. Next, Alex tackled the issue of permits. "I reviewed the permit process with the city," he explained. "Turns out, backyard play structures like treehouses don't require permits unless they pose a significant risk, like obstructing power lines or causing drainage problems. My treehouse meets all safety standards, so there's no legal basis for demanding its removal." Finally, he addressed the aesthetic argument. "The HOA claims the treehouse disrupts the neighborhood's visual harmony. But what exactly does that mean? Is it the color, the shape, or is it simply because it's different?" He gestured toward the window, where the treehouse stood nestled among the branches of the oak tree. "To me, it looks like part of nature, a place where kids can dream and explore. Isn't that something worth preserving?" By the time Alex finished his presentation, the mood in the room had shifted. Neighbors nodded approvingly, whispering to one another about how reasonable his point sounded. Mrs. Pemberton, however, remained unmoved. She raised her hand, signaling her intent to speak. Alex nodded politely, inviting her to the podium. "Mr. Carter raises valid questions," she began, her tone clipped and defensive. "But let's not forget that the HOA exists to protect property values and maintain consistency. Without clear guidelines, our neighborhood could descend into chaos." Her words carried a rehearsed quality, as though she'd delivered them countless times before. This was Alex's moment to shine. Instead of arguing, he responded with calm logic. "I agree that consistency is important," he said, stepping aside to let her stay at the podium. "But consistency also means applying rules fairly. Why is Mrs. Harper's garden shed allowed to stand despite exceeding height limits? Why hasn't anyone enforced noise complaints against the rental property 2 streets over? If we're going To follow the rules, let's do so equally. The audience erupted into murmurs of agreement. Mrs. Harper herself, seated near the front, looked visibly uncomfortable, while several neighbors exchanged knowing glances. Sensing weakness, other residents began speaking up. Mrs. Rodriguez recounted how her flower garden had been flagged for being too colorful, only to be ignored once she stopped planting new blooms. Mr. Patel described the frustration of losing his basketball hoop overnight, leaving his kids without a way to play outside. Even quieter voices joined in, sharing stories of unfair treatment or selective enforcement. Ms. Lynn, usually silent during such encounters, shifted awkwardly in her seat, avoiding eye contact. Mr. Grayson attempted to intervene, pointing out technicalities in the charter, but his arguments fell flat. The crowd was no longer listening to the HOA. They were united against it. When the floor opened for general comments, the momentum tipped decisively in Alex's favor. A young mother spoke about how much her children admired Jake and Liam's Treehouse, wishing they had something similar in their own yard. An elderly man praised Alex for standing up to bureaucracy, saying it reminded him of battles he'd fought decades ago. By the end of the meeting, the HOA's position had crumbled under the weight of public opinion. Mrs. Pemberton tried to salvage the situation, promising to review the matter further and consult with the board. But her words rang hollow. As the crowd dispersed, congratulating Alex on his thoughtful approach, she gathered her team and hurried out of the room, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Back at home later that evening, Alex sat on the porch, watching Jake and Liam climb excitedly into their beloved treehouse. The flag fluttered proudly in the breeze, a symbol of resilience and determination. Though the battle wasn't officially over, the HOA still had to issue a formal response. Alex knew he'd won the war. More importantly, he'd shown his boys that sometimes doing the right thing meant standing firm, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. As the 72-hour deadline loomed, Alex knew he couldn't afford to sit back and wait for the HOA to make their next move. He had spent years mastering the art of strategy in high-pressure situations, and now those skills were about to come into play in a way he never imagined, in his own backyard. The treehouse wasn't just a structure anymore. It had become a symbol of something bigger, standing up for what was right, even when faced with unreasonable demands. The first step in Alex's plan was gathering intelligence, understanding the rules, finding loopholes, and identifying allies. It was something he'd done countless times during his career, whether coordinating security details or managing diplomatic negotiations. Only this time, instead of briefing rooms and classified documents, his tools were neighborhood blueprints, HOA bylaws, and quiet conversations over coffee. Alex began by meticulously reviewing the HOA's charter, line by line. At first glance, the document seemed ironclad, filled with rigid regulations about everything from mailbox colors to fence heights. But as Alex read deeper, he noticed inconsistencies. Some clauses contradicted others, while others were so vaguely worded that they could be interpreted in multiple ways. For example, the infamous height restriction rule stated that no structure could exceed 8 feet. But it didn't clarify whether decorative elements like the flagpole counted toward that measurement. Similarly, the aesthetic guidelines mentioned harmony with surrounding properties, yet provided zero specifics on what that actually meant. Armed with these ambiguities, Alex turned his attention to researching local zoning laws. Unlike the HOA's self-imposed rules, zoning laws were legally binding and often superseded private agreements. After hours of digging through municipal websites and speaking with city officials, Alex discovered something crucial. The HOA's authority only extended to enforcing cosmetic standards. Structural concerns, such as safety or environmental impact, fell under the jurisdiction of the city. Since the treehouse posed no threat to either, the HOA's claims carried little weight, beyond appearances. But knowledge alone wouldn't win the battle. Alex needed support, and not just moral support. He needed people willing to speak out publicly against the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. That's where Mark, his beer-drinking neighbor, came in handy. Over the past few days, Alex had shared bits and pieces of his findings with Mark, who listened intently and nodded along. "You're onto something here," Mark said one evening, leaning back in his patio chair. "I've seen how they pick on certain folks while letting others slide. It's not fair." Encouraged by Mark's reaction, Alex decided to broaden his outreach. He reached out to other neighbors, carefully choosing individuals who had either experienced similar run-ins with the HOA or simply disliked its authoritarian approach. One of them was Mrs. Rodriguez, a retired schoolteacher whose bright yellow flower garden had once been flagged for being too colorful. Another was Mr. Patel, whose basketball hoop had mysteriously vanished overnight after an anonymous complaint. Both were eager to share their stories, though neither had dared challenge the HOA directly until now. With a small coalition forming, Alex shifted his focus to planning his counterattack. Rather than confront the HOA head-on, he opted for a more subtle approach: transparency. He drafted a formal response letter to the HOA, outlining his research and pointing out the flaws in their arguments. The tone was respectful but firm, emphasizing cooperation rather than defiance. "While I appreciate the importance of maintaining community standards," he wrote, "it is equally important to ensure that enforcement is consistent, fair, and based on clear criteria. I believe the current situation warrants further discussion before any action is taken." To accompany the letter, Alex organized a neighborhood meeting, not to argue, but to present his case openly and invite feedback. He reserved the community center's multi-purpose room for a Saturday afternoon session, sending invitations to every resident in the subdivision. His goal was simple: create a platform where everyone could voice their opinions, exposing the HOA's selective enforcement and fostering solidarity among homeowners. When the day of the meeting arrived, Alex arrived early to set up. He arranged folding chairs in neat rows facing a podium, hung a whiteboard on the wall, and placed copies of the HOA's charter and his own findings on a table near the entrance. As neighbors trickled in, he greeted each person warmly, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. By the time Mrs. Pemberton and her team entered, looking smug and ready to deliver their verdict, nearly 30 residents had gathered, a turnout far larger than anyone expected. The meeting began with Alex taking the podium. Dressed casually but neatly in jeans and a button-down shirt, he exuded calm confidence. "Thank you all for coming today," he started, his voice steady and clear. "This isn't about me or my treehouse. It's about ensuring that our community remains a place where we can live freely without unnecessary interference. Let's have an open conversation about the rules we follow and why." What followed was a masterclass in tactical communication. Alex walked the audience through his research using the whiteboard to highlight key points. He pointed out discrepancies in the HOA's enforcement history, citing examples like Mrs. Harper's oversized garden shed and Mr. Patel's missing basketball hoop. He explained how local zoning laws limited the HOA's power, emphasizing that structural issues fell outside their purview. Most importantly, he framed the discussion not as a personal grievance, but as a collective effort to hold the HOA accountable. As Alex spoke, murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Neighbors nodded, whispered to one another, and occasionally raised their hands to ask questions. When it was time for open comments, several residents stepped forward to share their experiences. Mrs. Rodriguez recounted how her vibrant flower garden had been deemed disruptive, despite receiving compliments from passers-by. Mr. Patel described the frustration of losing his basketball hoop, which his kids used daily. Even Mark chimed in, recounting how the HOA had ignored complaints about excessive noise from a rental property down the street. Mrs. Pemberton, seated stiffly in the front row, grew increasingly agitated as the meeting progressed. Her usual air of authority wavered under the weight of public scrutiny. When she finally tried to interject, Alex calmly acknowledged her presence. "Mrs. Pemberton, I understand your concerns," he said, maintaining eye contact. "But this is a dialogue, not a dictatorship. If we're going to enforce rules, let's do so fairly and consistently." His words struck a chord with the audience. By the end of the meeting, the tide had clearly turned. Residents applauded Alex's presentation, thanking him for shedding light on long-standing frustrations. Even some who had initially sided with The HOA softened their stance, admitting that the enforcement process felt arbitrary at best. For Mrs. Pemberton and her team, the meeting was a disaster. Their attempts to assert dominance crumbled in the face of overwhelming opposition. As the crowd dispersed, Alex approached them with a polite smile. "I hope this clears things up," he said, handing over a folder containing his findings and the signed petitions from supportive neighbors. "Let's work together to find a solution that works for everyone." Though the HOA members muttered vague promises and hurried away, Alex knew the battle wasn't entirely over. But he also knew he'd gained the upper hand, not through aggression, but through careful preparation, strategic thinking, and a willingness to engage with others. The treehouse remained standing, its faded flag fluttering proudly in the breeze, a testament to the power of standing firm in the face of adversity. The days following the neighborhood meeting felt like a turning point for Alex and his family, and for the entire community. The HOA's response came sooner than expected, delivered not in person but via a formal letter slipped into Alex's mailbox. It was brief, almost apologetic in tone, stating that after careful reconsideration, the treehouse would be allowed to remain standing. There were no fines, no demands for modifications, just a quiet acknowledgement that perhaps the initial complaints had been too hasty. For Mrs. Pemberton and her team, it was an uncharacteristic retreat, one that left them looking weak and exposed. But for Alex, it was validation that standing up for what was right, even against seemingly insurmountable odds, could lead to meaningful change. As word spread through the neighborhood, reactions varied. Some residents cheered openly, praising Alex for taking a stand. Others, who had quietly resented the HOA's heavy-handedness but never dared to speak out, now felt emboldened. A few die-hard supporters of the association grumbled under their breath, accusing Alex of stirring up trouble, but even they couldn't deny the growing sense of unity among homeowners. The treehouse, once just a simple play structure, had become a symbol of resistance, a reminder that rules existed to serve people, not control them. For Jake and Liam, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be when your backyard fort had suddenly gained legendary status. Their friends from school began stopping by more often, eager to see the famous treehouse they'd heard so much about. The boys proudly showed off their handiwork, the rope ladder they'd helped tie, the flagpole flying its weathered American flag, and the secret trapdoor Alex had promised to build, though he hadn't quite gotten around to it yet. To them, none of the drama mattered. All they cared about was having a magical space where they could dream, laugh, and imagine themselves as adventurers exploring uncharted territories. But for Alex, the experience carried deeper lessons. He realized how easy it was for people to accept unfair treatment when they believed they had no power to challenge it. The HOA's authority wasn't absolute. It relied on fear, compliance, and a lack of pushback. By shining a light on its inconsistencies and rallying support from his neighbors, Alex had shown that collective action could shift the balance of power. It was a principle he'd long understood in his professional life, but seeing it play out in such a personal context gave it new meaning. One evening, as Alex sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mark stopped by with a six-pack of beer. "Thought you might need this after everything," he said with a grin, handing over a cold bottle. They settled into lawn chairs, chatting about the aftermath of the meeting. "You know," Mark said after a pause, "people are talking. Not just about the treehouse, but about the HOA. Some folks want to revisit those bylaws, maybe make them less rigid." Alex nodded thoughtfully. "It's a start," he replied. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but at least people are paying attention now. That's half the battle." Mark chuckled. "Yeah, and if anyone tries to mess with your treehouse again, I think the whole neighborhood will rise up in arms." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, the upcoming football season, the latest antics of Mark's mischievous golden retriever. But Alex's mind kept circling back to the bigger picture. In many ways, the treehouse saga mirrored the challenges he faced in his work at the White House. Whether managing crises on a global scale or navigating disputes in his own backyard, the principles remained the same: preparation, communication, and perseverance. What set this experience apart, though, was the human element, the joy of seeing his boys' faces light up every time they climbed into their little fortress, the camaraderie of neighbors coming together, and the satisfaction of knowing he'd made a difference, however small. As summer gave way to fall, the treehouse became more than just a physical structure. It was a testament to creativity, resilience, and the importance of protecting simple joys in an increasingly complicated world. Leaves turned golden and red, blanketing the ground beneath the oak tree, and the air grew crisp with the promise of cooler days ahead. One afternoon, Alex decided to tackle the project he'd been putting off, building the secret trapdoor Liam had requested months earlier. With Jake and Liam eagerly supervising, he cut a square panel into the floor of the treehouse, adding hinges and a latch to complete the design. When it was finished, the boys erupted into cheers, immediately devising elaborate escape plans involving invisible enemies and daring rescues. Meanwhile, Mrs. Pemberton and her team seemed to fade into the background, their presence less imposing than before. Occasionally, Alex would catch sight of her walking briskly down the street, clipboard in hand, but she avoided eye contact. Rumors circulated that the HOA was scaling back its enforcement efforts, focusing instead on minor issues, like holiday decorations and recycling bins. While some neighbors joked about the treehouse effect softening their grip, others credited the shift to a broader awakening within the community. Whatever the reason, life in the neighborhood felt lighter, freer. By winter, the treehouse stood tall against the gray skies, its wooden planks weathered but sturdy. Snow gathered on its roof and icicles hung from the flagpole, glittering like crystals in the pale sunlight. On weekends, Alex bundled up the boys and sent them outside to play, reminding them to be careful on the slippery ladder. Indoors, he returned to his work at the White House, juggling emails and video calls while sipping hot coffee. Though his days were filled with high-stakes decisions and intricate logistics, part of him always looked forward to evenings spent unwinding with his family. Looking back, Alex knew the treehouse ordeal had taught him something valuable, not just about strategy or negotiation, but about the essence of leadership. True leaders didn't impose their will. They inspired others to act, to question, to care. They created spaces where people felt empowered to speak up, whether it was over a backyard fort or a neighborhood charter. And sometimes, they did it, all without ever saying a word. As spring approached, bringing with it the promise of renewal, Alex found himself reflecting on the journey. The treehouse still stood, a monument to childhood wonder and parental determination. It reminded him that even in the face of adversity, there was always room for hope, humor, and humanity. After all, life wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about finding creative ways to navigate it, one step at a time.